Well, welcome to 2024, everybody. Back to the Happy Cynics. And before we launch into our deprogramming project, which is coming up here soon, we want to we have the opportunity to have a guest with us today. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Kevin Mellish. He's a personal friend of mine and also a brilliant scholar. He's a professor of Hebrew scriptures and has his PhD from Claremont University. I'd like to welcome you to the show today, Dr. Mellish. And
yeah, it's great to be here. Nice to be with you, Kevin, and it's nice to see Isaac. It's been a little while since I've seen Isaac, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this exciting project, and look forward to the discussion that we're going to have this afternoon.
So we've been wanting to do something to give the readers some more background and context on the Israel-Palestine situation. So let's just start talking about what do we know, or what can you tell us about, say, the early history of that region? Like what has scholarship kind of given us about the settling of that region of Palestine?
Yeah, so based in my area of study and my discipline, one of the things that as a scholar and as one who studies the past, especially the ancient past, I always like to put things in a larger framework. And I think it's easy for us in the modern period to kind of look at these types of conflicts or situations that are erupting in a certain part of the world. And our understanding of it kind of goes back maybe 75 to 100 years. And that becomes kind of our immediate context for deciphering these events and how we interpret that and make sense of that. As a biblical scholar, as one who studies the ancient Near East, as one who's done work in archaeology, I like to stand back and take a much larger sweep of history, because I feel like it gives me a different perspective, and I'm able to kind of weigh those things out based upon a much larger context. Mm-hmm. The French have a saying, a term, they call it the longue durée, which is you don't look at something just in the immediate context, but you look at it over an extended period of time so that you're able to better adequately understand the dynamics and the reasons for changes, or the reasons why things take place. And as someone who works like in archaeology, we're talking spans of millennium here.
Yeah. So what would be like how far back have they discovered things?
So like here. So like if you look at someone like Ami Mazar, for example, and you start talking about like you're talking about the Middle East, say Syria-Palestine region, for example, you can go back to so when you think about that right after like hunter-gathering types of societies or a way of life, you start talking about like Natufian culture, for example, that goes back to about 10,500 BCE. You're talking about 12,000 years ago, for example.
Right.
And then you start to see early settlement patterns, and you start to see organized living and community life. I mean, we're talking almost 12,000 years ago.
Right.
And then you even get into so you have that, but then you get into something like even like as early as the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, which goes to about 8,500 BCE. And Jericho, right? Biblical Jericho, we talk about Jericho, like that's a city that already had not just settlement, but you've got impressive walls, you've got a massive tower, and already you not only have the settlement of people, but you start to have fortifications and structures, which already is an indication that there's movements of people. We've got to look for our security and our safety, and that's again, that's 8,500 BCE or and a little bit beyond. So this is what I'm talking about. Like when you look at what's happening in the Middle East today, as someone who, like myself, who steps back and then looks at the sweep of history, What I see happening, and not to say this to be callous or to somehow dismiss what's taking place, but what's happening today is, and when I look at the series or the sweep of history, this is another episode of a long episode that this stuff has been happening for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how far back you want to go, but
so even if we're going to understand what's going on here today, all right, would it be fair to say that a lot of the conflict here is you have two groups of people, Jews and Arabs, who both feel like we're the legitimate successors to Abraham. This is the land that God promised to Abraham. I mean, now, to what extent is that maybe a little naive, or do they see it differently? It does seem to me that most of the people that are like have their heels dug in on this, because I'm not really convinced that, say, I don't know what the percentages are. I don't know. It does seem like there's a fair number of Palestinians who aren't really interested in some sort of Muslim conquest of the area, as long as they still have the Dome of the Rock or whatever and have access to it. And then it seems to be a fair number of Jewish people. They just want to have a nation and their own place, but that wouldn't necessarily exclude other people from living there, whatever. But it's kind of like preserving our heritage sort of thing. But then you have the hardline people who also, and again, it's kind of hard for me as an outsider to really kind of size that up. It would be like looking at the United States from the outside and wondering, okay, how much, say, for example, do Trump supporters or Hillary Clinton supporters or Joe Biden supporters or whatever, how much do these groups of people represent the culture as a whole? And obviously it's more than that. But I guess my question is, so for these hardline folks, like, that seems to be where it would start. It would seem to me that the other people who are more moderate, that it's like, okay, the thing I can compare it to closest would be this. Let's say like the Native Americans here, okay, in North America. This notion that somehow where your ancestors were born or died or whatever, that sacred space, that goes back into a lot of different indigenous religions in different parts of the world, around the world. And so we still have this sense where you don't go touch football in a cemetery. It's just considered improper, disrespectful. Okay. You wouldn't let your kids go play hide and seek in the cemetery. It's like the place where the ancestors are or whatever, that's kind of like a sacred space. And so like we have some of that here, and we had some of those balance, that kind of thing. Although I don't know, like with so much mixing of cultures and ethnicities and races. So like I'm part Scottish, I'm part Dutch, part German. Okay, so at least half Scottish though. I mean, I wouldn't mind visiting Scotland, but it's not like anything where I feel like I'm going to be incomplete as a person if I don't, understand who William Wallace was or something, or, get my own kilt,
right,
or something. But I'm trying to understand, like, so I guess for the people that are hardliners, like, at what point do we really see, okay, this is where this people group really starts to emerge? So that would be my question.
So let me say a couple things to that. So I went pretty far back. I was just giving an example of how far back this goes. So when I talk about like that early history, those folks that were settling in Syria-Palestine, Neolithic period, Chalcolithic period, early Bronze Age, even maybe Middle Bronze Age, all of those folks predate what we would understand to be, in the biblical sense, the people we would call Israel.
Right.
So I think that's why when we stand back and we look at history, what we are reading about in the biblical text in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, many scholars think that when we talk about proto-Israel or the earliest formation of Israel, we're really talking somewhere probably around the late Bronze Age, let's just say around the 13th century BCE. Okay. And this dovetails with what you were talking about, because even when we're talking about proto-Israel, who were those folks? And scholars and archaeologists, historians, and those that study the biblical text, even when you're trying to understand the identity of who these folks are, it's a mixed heritage, like you were talking about.
Right.
And it's interesting to me because in Exodus 12, even when, as a historical reminiscing of these people, it refers to them as a mixed multitude, as a mixed rabble almost. And so delineating their identities, who they are, their origins, that becomes complicated to try and extract all that out. So when we're talking about proto-Israel, many scholars believe that when we're talking about the people that would become Israel, there was a substantial element that were Canaanite, people from within Canaan.
Right.
As part of the breakdown of the late Bronze Age society, these that were Canaanite peasants, they would say many of them flocked to the highlands in the central hill country to take refuge as in a way to escape that old city-state oppressive system that was governed essentially by the Egyptian Empire. But you also have folks, right, that probably came from without too, that entered into Palestine. And even the biblical text has some recognition of people coming from outside as immigrants coming in.
Right.
And our best understanding is that early Israel, proto-Israel, was probably a combination of Canaanite elements, groups, possibly coming in from the outside and merging together. It's interesting to me, too, because when you talk about the worship of Yahweh, Yahweh is not indigenous to the land of Canaan. Yahweh, not only in biblical tradition, but archaeological, historical sources, seems to be associated with the territory of Midian, northwest Arabia. So that becomes a question: how did the worship of Yahweh enter into the land of Canaan? Right. Well, somebody brought that with them.
Right.
I say all that to say this, is that so when you're talking about that like late bronze, that kind of that early formative period, proto-Israel, which we locate especially in the Central Highlands, late Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age 1 period, that was most likely a mixture of folks, right? A subset of Canaanites, native Canaanites from the land, most likely other groups from the outside that came in and began to assimilate, not just in life, but also in adopting culture and religious values and ideas and other types of shared elements of life that they eventually coalesced into this group of people that would eventually come what we would understand to be, we would identify as biblical Israel.
Right.
So I say all that to say, even when we're dealing with that, just in terms of biblical Israel, quote unquote biblical Israel, who are they? What do they look like? Right? Even that story has complexity, and it's not just simple, straightforward. But the very people that were indigenous to the land appear to be an important element of that group. In fact, the term Israel, El, is a Canaanite term. And so it's interesting that even the name Israel connotes that heritage and that historical element of their story. So I hope that helps.
In an effort to sort of summarize the main ideas here, would it be wrong to say that part of what seems to have defined Proto-Israel is that none of them belonged or had a home? Like you're talking about peasant refugees from the city-states and immigrants coming in from Egypt and the surrounding country.
There was that. So people that were displaced,
Mm-hmm.
either migration or fleeing to the Central Highlands, but also ideologically, religiously too. For those folks, for example, that were fleeing the old Canaanite city system that broke down at the end of the late Bronze Age. I don't want to get too technical here, but that was an oppressive system. Those folks, it was kind of like almost like a medieval feudal system where you had a city-state with a king, a bureaucracy, and the surrounding peasants, right, who lived just outside the city. They worked the fields. They're the ones that plowed the land. They're the ones that produced the food, the agricultural and the other animal and other products that would then often go to the service of the king. And so that movement was a movement away from an oppressive political economic system as well. And you get a group which we would call a group associated with Egypt, right? That associates living under Pharaoh to be an oppressive system. Well, as these groups begin to migrate and coalesce, they see within their own stories, they see something very similar. And they see within early laws or Torah codes, right? They see a way of life that is much more not hierarchical, but much more
egalitarian.
We don't get the stratification, but we get more that people are relating to one another on a more equal basis. And that's part of it too. So yeah, there is the migrating, but there's also the ideological religious underpinnings that's typifying the way of life. And I don't want to get into this, but once we start to see in Israel, then we start to get more centralizing again with the figures of the kings and monarchs and government. That whole egalitarian concept begins to get affected again.
Yeah, and
not in a good way.
If I'm remembering from my class in Deuteronomistic history, it's the reintroduction of the king that eventually leads to the downfall of Israel.
Precisely. And it's the emergence of that type of system then that leads to their own oppression. It leads to we're simply servants of the king. Everything that we grow, everything that we make, even our own children and family members, they are now they are used in the service of the king and his bureaucracy. So I didn't want to take a left turn there, but it wasn't just immigration. It was also this way of life, a way of living. So
to bring that up into the present, when we're talking about the identity of Israel, at least in history, it seems to be Israel is identified by the oppressed.
I would say that. And even as we start to get moving further into, if I want to be careful, like more historical certainty, like when we start getting into
like the exile.
Yeah, like when you start looking at, for example, the time of the monarchy and the nation states of Israel and Judah, right? 10th, 9th, 8th, 7th century. We're also going to see, as it relates to this too, we're also going to see Israel, its fortunes and its destinies are going to be tied to the larger emerging world empires. So how Israel and who Israel aligns itself with is going to have very much implications for the fortunes of that particular part of the region. And kind of like today, right? We have the strategic piece of land.
Right.
We have Israel. We have Palestine, the people that live there. But we also see this at the center of world powers, too, how other world powers relate to this piece of land. Something similar in ancient times that continued on, right? Not just with the Assyrians, but the Babylonians, the Persians, then the Greeks, the Romans, right? You name it, and the list goes on.
And part of the new sort of egalitarian structure of proto-Israel is interpreted, if I remember correctly, is interpreted in the biblical text as this isn't just for Israel. This is an example to the surrounding area of you have all these oppressive kingdoms surrounding Israel that want to take advantage of it, and Israel's there to challenge those systems.
Exactly, and we want to be a people that are different from the system that we came from.
Right.
We want to have a community, and we want to establish a way of life that distinguishes us from those old economic, political standards that we had before, or the life that was known. And it's interesting because, again, in the biblical text, when the people are demanding a monarch or a kingship, that's not seen as a good thing, right? It's kind of introducing those types of elements into society that they were fleeing from in the first place. And in the biblical text, this is ultimately going to lead to your own downfall. And it does, right? It does.
So, okay, so my impression has always been, not always, but I would say it is now. I'm not sure when I started understanding anything about this. Because I mentioned the exile.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, so like the history that we're getting so far, we could probably pretty easily find other cultures in different parts of the world are going to have similar type histories. Mm-hmm. You have different groups settling in. You have certain groups being oppressed by others, and that sort of thing. When you start thinking like more of what part of this is carrying over into the present, okay? So like, and I don't want to get into discussing Zionism, but say for that type of sentiment, I just, it's been my understanding that a lot of that was driven by the exiles. Now, that is something that doesn't happen very often in different parts of the world. And so, like, you're dealing with, like, it seems that culture, the Jews themselves were changed forever by the exile. And so, like, the whole notion of the land and our culture, our heritage, and this is really when a lot of the religious texts are written. Is that correct?
Yeah. So,
isn't this where they start to coalesce and try to protect, and to keep from getting diffused?
One of the things I talk about in my classes is that the exile, not just the destruction of Jerusalem, the deportation, but the whole experience it becomes a really crystallizing experience for these folks, ideologically, religiously, in terms of their own self-identification, and just their history going forward. So when Israel is taken into exile, right, that leads to a lot of existential questions about what is our relationship with God, what's that going to look like going forward, but also how do we maintain our identity of the faith and the traditions of our ancestors, for example? How do we do that in a multicultural, pluralistic society where we are refugees, right, where we are on the outside?
Right.
And that becomes, it's in that period, right, that you get certain practices, certain dietary types of prescriptions and so forth. Circumcision becomes a big thing. But as you mentioned, also the final putting together of the Pentateuch or the Torah as a way to not only help us to know how we're supposed to move forward as Jews, even from the post-exilic period onward, but also talking about who we are as a people and our identity. It tells our story, and it just doesn't tell our story where we came from and that type of thing. But then going forward, what does it mean to be the people of God, especially when you start to try and reconstitute life post-exile and moving forward?
Well,
but so it does all that.
It does seem to me than even the notion of, well, we are a special people chosen by God. That seems to go hand in hand with holding on to the hope that we're going to be able to return back to our homeland and recover our traditions, our culture, our heritage.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, at least when you're talking about the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, when you talk about like the stories of Abraham and the ancestors and so forth, it does kind of coalesce around a couple of important kind of promises or kind of
Right.
hopes. The idea of descendants
Right.
and offspring, but also a place, a home. And what does that look like? You know, when you've been in exile, then you come back. You know, there were still people there, right? And not only were there people there, but there were also people that were imported there.
Right. Right.
And so when we look at the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, what we're getting the perspective of the folks that understand themselves to be the Jewish community. What ends up happening with the Samaritans, for example, and other peoples that don't make it, you know, into the biblical text. And even, you know, even with books like Ezra and Nehemiah, you start to see trying to make distinctions between themselves and surrounding peoples. And now there, it's not about we're going to drive them from the land, but we're going to try and make a distinction, right?
Right.
And I would just say, you know, to be fair for the Jewish community, right? Not, you know, in the post-exilic period, but that continue. One of the things I tell my class, for example, right? But they also understand themselves to be in a unique relationship with God. So, like before the exile, Israel was most likely they practiced syncretism. Not to say that they didn't honor Yahweh, but they also, and the biblical text, right, archaeology and biblical text shows us that they were very much syncretistic. They worshipped other gods. But when they come back from exile, that they become more or less monotheistic.
Yes, right.
And so that says something about who they are and who they understand themselves to be in terms of this relationship to this God and the promises that this God made to their ancestors, their distant ancestors or family members. And so for them, then it's not just coming back to the land, but it's understanding themselves kind of in this more unique way.
Well, it seems to me that is a natural consequence. So, like, okay, you're rooted out of your homeland.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you return back, and there's other people already settled there now.
Yeah.
Well, there needs to be, like, if you're not just going to let your former culture diffuse into what has displaced you in the past couple hundred years, it does seem to me that you come back to it's like the old true Scotsman fallacy. It's like the real, like, it's like, oh, we're not Americans. It's the Cherokee and the Iroquois who are the real Americans.
Well, there's the whole idea of shibboleth.
Yes.
How you pronounce that word is whether you're in or out.
Well, like in other words, there's like you say, uniqueness, and it's not only like we're going to be unique in the way we have these practices that other people don't do, like circumcision. We're going to be unique in the foods that we're going to eat and not eat. We're even now going to be unique in our religion. Okay, we're not going to accept that other religions anymore. This is Yahweh is now. We've decided Yahweh is going to be our God, and this all seems to be centered around preserving and protecting your cultural identity.
For sure. And so that's why this exilic experience is so essential for understanding Judaism,
right?
And this formative period in their story and in their history as helping to really kind of clarify and crystallize who they are. Because, and let me just say this too, because even though there are Jews that would come back to Jerusalem and Judea, not everybody does.
Right.
You still have
Right.
Jews that remain in Mesopotamia. You
Yes.
have Jews that are in Egypt. You'll eventually have Jews, right, all scattered throughout the Mediterranean world.
Right.
And so,
and even up into Central Europe.
well, all over. And so it's going to be those kind of centralizing tenets that help us to understand who we are in comparison to others, even no matter where we're at. But if I can come back, but that was especially true, that became very important then for their story. You know, you think they come back during the Persian period, but then when the Greeks, the Greeks come along and they want to introduce Hellenism, right, and Greek ways of life and Greek ways of doing things, not just religion, but also their practices. And then in particular, right, then when you start to get the Greek rulers, the Seleucids, especially Antiochus IV, then who really wants to foist a foreign way of living and thinking upon these Jewish folks, right? We just got done celebrating Hanukkah not long ago, right?
Right.
And trying to force people to adopt these ways of living, even with the threat of persecution. And you see resistance to that. So it's interesting that even though for most of its period following the exile, that the Jewish people in Israel-Palestine really won't, outside of the Hasmonean period, but who are going to be under the thumb of foreign rulers and governments still trying to maintain a specific identity. And
now the Hasmoneans, just for our listeners,
sorry,
they were from Judas Maccabeus,
right?
Sons,
So
right?
when around 164 or so, 165, when the Seleucids under Antiochus IV were really trying to press the Jews to adopt Greek ways of life there in Judea and throughout the land, that Judas Maccabeus, a priest, and his sons, they rebelled against this, and they actually started a revolt, an armed revolt, and helped to liberate the country from Seleucid control.
It was a revolting development.
Yeah. and reclaiming, one of the things they did is reclaiming the Jewish temple, which had been desecrated by Antiochus, reclaiming it, rededicating it. That's what Hanukkah means. It's the rededication, the cleansing of that. And that's what we know today as the festival of Hanukkah, which is still very relevant to the Jewish community. But there's a case, right, where religious identity and their values, right, even and even beyond, even beyond the point where they had a period of independence, but when they're even under the thumb of foreign rulers and different governments, they still hold on to that core of who they are, and I think that becomes, those kinds of things do lead to the kinds of some of the things that we're seeing today in terms of their identity, who we are. And even the land, it's interesting. I don't want to get technical here, but so like when you look at like a book like Joshua, where it talks about God giving the land to the people, it's interesting because it's actually a participle form in Hebrew, and participle means kind of this idea of an ongoing reality, an ongoing verb.
Okay.
And so the idea is that some look at that and say, this is God still giving it to us, this kind of thing. But those kinds of traditions, those kinds of the messages from these sacred texts, they can, right? They have influenced people in terms of how they understand themselves even today, relationship to the land, and how they view their presence there, and which adds to just another layer of the complexity, right, of the kind of issues that we're seeing today. But maybe I'm jumping ahead too quick here.
So thinking about this through the lens of like modern sociology, one of the ways I think I would connect to these ideas is that certain communities are born out of a exclusion from the dominant group in society, right? So thinking in modern times, the LGBTQ community is essentially a product of the definition of homosexuality and its treatment as a mental illness and the oppression that came along with that essentially birthed that community. The neurodivergent community is essentially birthed out of neurotypical oppression of neurodivergent people. I mean, it's everywhere. This happens over and over again. It's well understood in sociology. And a lot of times throughout history, that oppressive group then becomes in perpetuity the only acceptable group. Right. And I think, we see that with Israel, but also, and I'm not an expert in Islamic history. I think actually Dr. Lowry would know far more than I do.
And I don't claim to be an expert, but that's going to be go ahead, because I want to move around to talking about the other side and the Palestinians, and then we'll try to put it together.
Yeah. So from what I understand of Muhammad's life, he was essentially persecuted in both Mecca and Medina.
Yes.
And that sort of birthed this like Islamic militant caliphate movement.
Yeah,
even during the life of Muhammad.
I did some reading, and from what I've read, all right, and I'm willing to be corrected on this, and if I need to retract something, I will. But from what I've read, early on, the Prophet Muhammad encouraged even early Muslims to face Jerusalem to pray.
Right.
Because Muhammad really, and if you read the Quran, I mean, the Quran is really largely a reinterpretation of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures.
Right.
Okay. And Muhammad is trying to bring monotheism to the Arabian Peninsula. Okay. And he has this great admiration for the monotheism of Judaism and Christianity, has them facing, but from what I read, when he was very sharply rejected by the Jews at Medina, this kind of, this is when he then had them, Muslims start facing the Kaaba to pray.
Yeah.
And one thing led to another. The whole thing about the Dome of the Rock, that's even disputed, because there's just a reference where he said like the farthest mosque.
Right.
But at that point in time in his life, there wasn't even a mosque in Jerusalem. But that later gets interpreted, and whether that was used as an excuse or whatever, there was always this reverence toward the Temple of Solomon as a place of God. Okay, and well, then that ends up happening. So with the conquest of Islam in that region, so you end up with more diaspora, because in the conquering of that region by Muslims, especially under Umar, okay, you had a lot of the Jewish people went out to the Iberian Peninsula. So you end up with what became the Sephardic Jews, and the other Jews started moving northward, became the Ashkenazi Jews. Okay, but here the Christians, launching the Crusades starting in 1095, trying to retake. They retook Jerusalem like 2 or 3 times and then lost it each time. Like they couldn't hold on to it.
Right.
But now it's like, so here's the other thing. So you not only had the exile, which kind of pushed, I should, and I don't want to mischaracterize this, but you can almost say it kind of pushed the Jewish people because they were, you already covered this pretty brilliantly. There was a fair amount of diversity there.
Yeah.
But it kind of forced them into this kind of ethnocentrism as kind of a defensive thing, as a means of self-preservation. And then once they finally are able to reestablish that under Herod and him remodeling and expanding, rebuilding the temple, but then when the Romans level this, and then it's only a couple centuries later before they can get it rebuilt. Yeah. Then here come the Muslims, and then they erect a building on top of it, of the site. Now you have not only the exile has kind of pushed, but now the spread of Islam, the conquest of Islam, and that is. So now you're not just talking about, okay, we were exiled and we come back, and now there's other people who've already settled there, but now. Because some of the Muslims, it wasn't just a conversion of people that were indigenous, and there was some of that. I don't know how much you know about the Pact of Umar. The Pact of Umar, I include this in world religions because basically the way it was, you were not persecuted or punished if you were quietly Jewish or Christian, okay. You just weren't allowed to be noisy about it or do it out in the streets. You could go to your place of worship, but you couldn't repair anything. You would be protected. So you weren't going to be persecuted, and the government would protect you. Yeah. That was the Pact of Umar. We'll protect you, but you keep your religion to yourself, and you're not to display crosses or Star of David or this other stuff. And then so. After one or two generations, most of the people, the children, grandchildren, would pretty much just convert to Islam anyway. Okay. But there were new people came in, Arabic people, with these conquests. Yeah. So now you have those people there too, which I assume now is the Palestinian people are, I would assume, and I don't know, some of them probably have Arabic. Yeah. Heritage, and some of them may have been indigenous to the region of people who converted to Islam. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think, I want to be careful how I say this. I think when we talk about Palestinians, I think I want to be careful, but I think there's
because just like Syrians weren't Arabic, but they have some Arabic, right? Yeah. So you have like Syria, Jordan. I'm trying to think of some of the, the other surrounding regions, but they weren't like, it wasn't like Saudi Arabia in that strict ethnicity. Because there's even tension between Iran, Persians, and the Arabs. Right. Okay, so there's even tension there because Iran is Shia. But Saudi Arabia is Sunni. Yeah. And so you have a fair amount of tension between those two nations. So even like a lot of the Muslims in that region, they're not all indigenous. They're not all like Arabic people who came in, but there is some Arabic culture there.
And we have to remember too that so you continue. So you had the Romans for a while, right?
Right.
And then for a short time, the Persians again kind of take control of Jerusalem in that region. With different empires and different rulers, that does have implications for the people in that region.
Right.
So sometimes it's favorable, sometimes it's not. So sometimes it's trying to practice accommodation. Sometimes it's either expelling or maybe even exterminating at times. It just depends on what period of history you're talking about. That's all I was just trying to say.
Yeah, and to go back to my original point that I think kicked off this discussion, it is the persecution of the dominant culture that creates these very strong identities, community identities be they ethnic or not.
Which
That
I think
kinda
is,
drives,
I think it's
what,
maybe a lesson from history that we can really maybe think about.
yeah. Well, and I think that drives the modern conflict. You know, these memories of
Yeah.
oppression are what create such a strong,
Yeah.
you know, identity that
Yeah.
could justify such violence.
No, exactly. No, for sure. For sure.
So I guess the question I'm going to ask then, are we looking at, say, to what extent is the Israel-Palestine situation really about two groups of people who've both viewed themselves as being oppressed and needing to stand up for their rights? And how, I mean, I don't really plan on offering any great words of wisdom for how this can be resolved, except this is similar to me, say, let's say if we want to look at like the British Isles. So Ireland, you have especially Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland,
Yeah.
you have Scotland and England.
Don't forget Wales.
Wales. I don't know. I knew a fellow that used to live in Wales, Jonah. That was an old Groucho Marx joke. I'll cite my sources, but yeah, he did that on You Bet Your Life. He had a contestant from Wales, and he said, "I knew a fellow who lived in Wales, Jonah." Well, anyway, but no, the same kind of thing where it's like, well, we're being oppressed by the English, and so then you get this pushback of, no, we got to have our independence. We need to be able to do our own thing.
Right.
How do you get people to settle down? And this is the part, okay, that now I think it only gets exacerbated because it gets being tied in with religion. So I think it seems to me from our discussion, okay, so Judaism was one of the earliest, well, okay, except for Zoroastrianism, and that's another discussion about whether Zoroastrianism had this influence on the Jewish people. I wasn't really intending on bringing it up, but the idea of monotheism, to me, is also tied to this notion of having a particular cultural identity. But then the cultural identity gets tied in with a religious identity. And so like there's a difference between, say, the Muslims who I think their tie to the region is really almost strictly for religious reasons. Except, this is, we've been here for a couple centuries and all that. There is that, okay, but not like, well, this is our ancestral home, and so we're kind of coming back to the homeland of the land of our patriarchs and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think the difficulty with that is that modern Palestinians, and going back like 100 years, weren't just Arab or Islamic.
Right.
There's a good mix of Jewish and Christian.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, it's a fairly diverse region before it becomes settled.
Yes.
By Israel.
If we're talking about ways to try and how do you address this and possible solutions to it, we were kind of looking at the issue of history, and one of the things I was just trying to kind of convey was that even with the different rise and fallings of different empires and the control that they had on this region, you see both things at times. You see the dominant group that either tries to exterminate or get rid of or remove people that they don't think belong there.
Yeah.
Or, on the other hand, you also see governments at times then trying to, let's try to accommodate. And there are examples where, okay, we're going to honor, we're going to respect the different opinions, different ways of life, different religious symbols and holy sites and that kind of thing.
Right.
And even make accommodations for that. so I think, again, when you look at a situation like this now, this is why I think reflecting upon the past can help us, because we can look to examples when there was a sense of allowing people to practice, their religious traditions that they're so important to them. And I will say with Judaism too, I don't want to speak for the Islamic side because I don't feel qualified to do that. But even within Judaism, there came a point, especially like when you're looking at rabbinical Judaism and so forth, there was a way that they would then begin to talk about people who are not part of the Jewish community, that there was a basic underlying respect and understanding that we all kind of live under the covenant of Noah, for example.
Right.
And we can use that as a way to see that we're all part of God's creation, and that then impacts the way then we see other people who are outside of our group and how we can begin to relate to one another. So I don't know if that contributes to this or not, but
well, okay. So I mean, this is the thing. I mean, because these dynamics, as far as cultural, I mean, you can see this all over the world. I mean, it's, to pick on the Muslims and the Jews because of this region. I mean, everybody still segregates to be with people who are like them. I mean, we still have Native American reservations. And to a certain extent, Native Americans want to have these ancestral lands. Okay. I don't really, I don't know. I'm not really that worried about ancestral lands myself. Right. I mean, yeah. I don't really, I understand where people want to have that, but at some point, like as the world gets more and more populated, and the more we keep making less and less of it inhabitable with different things that we're doing, we're going to have to learn, like we're not going to be able to be so territorial. And yet, for example, like you go up Chicago, and there's one part that's Chinatown, and then there's another part, everybody kind of segregates. It's just like you get groups, big company, and then like you get like different little groups of people sitting in the cafeteria together or whatever.
Right.
Okay. So like there's always going to be that sort of part of it. It's just when it starts now taking religious overtones. Yeah. That's where it's no longer like a cultural thing, and can we make some kind of compromise? Right. So that we can both have our own culture, but still not be threatened by other people's culture round about us. When you start, and now you have religion being developed into monotheism, it starts taking on absolute terms. Okay. That is and so this is the thing. So of the three, you can see the progression. So of the three monotheistic faiths, the oldest one is the one who is the least literal in interpreting monotheism or in religious beliefs. Christianity is then following Judaism. I don't know how many centuries it may take before Islam was already moving in a more secular direction under the Ottoman Empire. And then you had Wahhabi and others who pushed back and started this within the last 2 centuries, this more fundamentalist movement. And we saw the same thing happen around the same time period in Christianity with the American fundamentalist movement. Even the Protestant Reformation, to a certain extent, was a reaction against Catholic humanism and the Renaissance. And the Protestant reformers weren't going to hang paintings of nudes in their homes. Right. And so I guess what I want to say is there is the part of it is cultural,
mm-hmm.
and if people can get carried away with trying to protect culture or being too isolationist with their culture, okay, but then there's religion, and religion ends up being the kind of like the wild card that you play that trumps everything else. And so that's why the people that are losing the popular vote in the United States, they want to appeal to some sort of Christian nationalism or something. It's like God's on our side sort of thing, and that those end up being like old world ways of thinking, because there's no way of resolving that with a compromise except for like an all-out war.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, again, with the Palestine situation, even for a number of the Jewish people who may not even be all that religious, there are still, it seems to me that some of the cultural identity has a quasi-religious nature to it. In other words, like if you don't circumcise your boy, you're not a real Jew, kind of a thing. And I'm only speaking as an outsider.
Well, what I would say too is, and I also think you also see your story in the story of your ancestors.
Yes.
So, like when Abraham, Terah's family's migrating from
right.
Mesopotamia to a land that I will show you. Those types of templates, those types of traditions, become a lens by which we see our own trajectories, right? Our own history, even our own personal stories. That even if you're not quote unquote religious, right? That's kind of like that's your heritage, right? Like that's our ancestry. Even our distant great ancestors, we find ourselves in the same boat. You know what I'm saying? And so,
but there's a big difference between there's a difference between saying we happen to like this land versus this is the land that God promised to us. I mean, there's a big difference between those two. If I'm at least saying, well, hey, we have history here, mm-hmm. we have heritage here, and we like to live here, well, then at least you got some basis for discussing, okay, if outsiders come in, it's just like, okay, are we going to have an official language?
Yeah.
Do the outsiders have to learn our language or not? Okay, we bring this up in the United States. It's a lot easier when it doesn't have those religious overtones. When it gets down to, I guess, let's put it this way. When religion starts moving past God caring about just the way we treat other people and whether we are loving and just people and things like that, justice and love and basic principles. When you start getting down to now, it's about what kind of clothes you wear, whether how much of a woman's body can be exposed, or what kind of food you eat and the way it's prepared. Can you eat the cheeseburger or not? I mean, this is where now you start getting into nitpicky stuff that really, is this really moral, or is this just some ceremonial cultural identity type thing that really, I don't think really has any basis in the modern world.
And I think, you're kind of talking about that as it relates to this issue,
And I was trying to hit on both sides of that too.
Exactly.
With the hijab and then
I think the issue becomes, can we share this space?
Yes.
Can we share this land?
Right.
And what is that going to look like?
Right.
And to try and do that in a way that is best as possible, that is just and respectful and fair to all those that are involved. Is everybody always going to be happy? I think with that, there also has to be accommodation. There has to be maybe some compromise amongst everybody. And the question becomes, can we do that? And
Well, people aren't going to do that until they either don't take their religion as seriously. Like once religion gets tied into this, then you either have to just back away from religion, or you have to say, well, maybe God doesn't really care now whether we, have next door neighbors who don't think like us or whatever.
And it's rethinking those earlier,
those
earlier teachings or precepts that were maybe so fundamental for, such a long time.
And that's the thing, see, because Muslim people have to keep in mind that this isn't the 7th century anymore. Jewish people should keep in mind that this isn't, 1100 BC either.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, at some point, you carry the values and principles, but not necessarily. And this is where, like, from what I've read, like in the United States and I think in Europe, I think the majority of Jewish people don't really even worry about observing the Shabbat in a strict sense. They may still take like a day off and rest and things. But again, it's more of a cultural thing. It's not like, okay, you're going to, condemn stone your neighbor because you see him mowing the grass on Saturday. Most people like, okay, well, that had a place in time. Okay, but we can move past that. And it's just like, there's nothing wrong with embracing tradition, history, heritage, and all of that, as long as you keep it in context and then ask, well, what's our context today?
Yeah.
Now, how does that play out today?
Yeah, you're talking about like maybe a Jew who doesn't observe Shabbat, formally, doesn't go to a synagogue or something like that. But I'm very much concerned about the ethical treatment of my neighbor. How do you weigh that out? Like, I may not do Shabbat observance, but theoretically, I'm living by the precepts and the principles that I find within our sacred tradition, for example.
Well, I'm still trying to live my life in a way that I believe is pleasing to God. Yeah. I just don't. Today, it doesn't make sense in our context to say that God still cares about whether, we put cheese on our hamburgers.
Right.
Is that really boiling a calf in its mother's milk?
Yeah.
I mean, really? But anyway.
I think it's important to remember, as we're talking about like the modern expressions of these religions, that the majority of Israeli and Palestinian people just want to live and be left alone. Like they're not, most Israeli citizens aren't like, well, we need to just murder all the Palestinians. Like, that's not something that is, it's not a populist movement. It's the same in Palestine. The impetus to, kick out all the Israelis isn't a populist movement. This is a top-down thing. And I think part of that mandate comes from the West. So, we know that on the Israeli side, you have America basically encouraging the eradication of the Palestinians. And on the Palestinian side, you have Russia. And these are two, I mean, I don't know if it's a proxy war, but I don't know if I would say that. But it is an expression of global superpowers.
It's not the first time. I mean, because the United States essentially helped create the Taliban because they didn't want the Soviet Union taking over Afghanistan. This is nothing new.
And you look at a group like Hamas, for example, they're being supported and funded by the Iranian government, which Hamas is not moderate in any sense of the word. So in essence, you get
then you'll get the argument that they were democratically elected in 2008. But if you look,
but they never have elections anymore, right?
So is Putin.
Well, so if you look at the campaign materials from when whatever that Hamas guy's name is, I can't remember it right now. But if you look at his campaign materials, he campaigned on a platform of very moderate. Like, we're just gonna negotiate peace and we're not going to like pursue any armed conflict. And he just like immediately turned his back on that.
Yeah.
And it is all lies. So the Palestinian people, in electing him, if it was a fair election at all, assuming that, were voting for a moderate response to Israel. So, it's interesting how much of this is the expression of oppression on the people of both Palestine and Israel.
Yeah.
And if you think about the Israeli identity being, or the proto-Israeli identity being, or I guess not, Israeli is the modern state, but the proto-Israel identity being those who are oppressed, those who are without a home.
Yeah.
That expression might be just the people of Palestine and Israel.
Yeah. And I think the question becomes, to what extent do the voices and the opinions and the perspectives of just the everyday people, do they get shouted out because you're only hearing certain voices, you're only hearing certain opinions, and that can then
the most radical people, usually ones that shout the loudest.
Yeah.
And they're the ones that end up getting heard the first, because our curiosity gets the best of us. I mean, it's just to look at the way things are reported. They always pick the most sensationalistic. It's like they're not going to, typically we're not going to read stories on how two next door neighbors get along really well.
Right.
It's like, somebody pulled a gun on somebody else, and wow, that's exciting, But and then it to a certain extent it kind of glorifies opposition, conflict, and all of that. And I really enjoyed this conversation.
I was just going to say that's why we're out here in the West,
right?
And that would be any word of caution that I would just have for those of us that are not personally and immediately involved in a situation like this, to step back and to say, okay, whose voices am I hearing? What perspectives are we seeing? Do I get a chance to hear the voice of the people on the ground? And if we're trying to make decisions for our own life about how we view this and how we ethically evaluate it, there's a lot of things that have to be, I think, weighed out, just on a personal level.
Absolutely. Well, is there anything that we didn't cover that we should cover? I think this is a good stopping point. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Kevin.
That was a lot of fun.
I want to thank Dr. Mellish for being here today. And you didn't say too much there today, Isaac, but you chimed in once in a while.
Yeah, I've got two people who know more than me here.
Well, I pretend anyway. I try not to, but this has been very enlightening. I appreciate you giving us.
Thanks for the invitation.
Background.
Yeah,
this has been great.
Yeah.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this wraps it up for today, and we've enjoyed this, and hope you have found it enlightening in some way. And we hope you have a great day. And just remember who you are. Don't sever your roots, but also let's all kind of open our hearts to others and be willing to share. Take care. God bless, and have a great day.